Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be doing my playoffs primer video. If you saw my Midseason Madness version of this video, it's going to be the exact same type of video. I'm going to go through, I'm going to talk about all 12 teams in the playoffs. Give you a rundown on basically what they've done this season, their strengths, their weaknesses, their star players, players to watch out for, all that type of stuff. Basically, if you're someone who's new, you are not someone who knows the Overwatch League super well, you just started playing Overwatch 2, you learn about the Overwatch League, you're curious to learn more about the teams in this, playoffs for this year, this is the video for you. And if you're someone who isn't new, but you are just kind of looking for a little bit of more information or my kind of general thoughts on some of the teams, or just a little bit of a refresher, and you want a little bit of mental note before you fill out your bracket, this is also for you. Before we jump in, just a couple things to talk about. I'm going to be doing this in order of their seeding in this tournament. So I'm starting at number 1 and ending with number 12. So that is the order for these teams, just to let you know in advance. And this is going to be a somewhat brief overview of all the teams. I'm not going to get super in-depth in any one particular team. I'm going to try to keep each team's kind of discussion relatively short so we can kind of keep this video moving. But that's all I really need to know about this kind of format. Going into the playoffs this year, I think it's a really, really interesting playoff. I think it is the most wide open playoff field we have ever had in the Overwatch League. In 2018, everybody assumed that New York was going to win. Obviously, they did not. It was the London Spitfire who ended up winning that one, but that was a big surprise when they won. 2019, pretty much everyone thought it was going to be the Shock or the Titans. It was the Shock. 2020, Shock or the Dragons, it was the Shock. 2021, everybody thought it would be the Shanghai Dragons, and it was the Shanghai Dragons. This year, there is a number of teams that I think realistically have a shot. The door is pretty wide open for anybody to win it this year, so it's a really exciting playoffs for this year. So let's just jump in and let's start talking about the teams. Let's start with the global number 1 seed, the Dallas Fuel. Obviously, they are representing the Western region here, but some of their success this year, they got first in the Summer Showdown in North America, or the Western region, this year, as well as they were second in the Kickoff Clash. So both regional tournaments this year, they've looked pretty good. However, in the international tournament, the Midseason Madness, they did not look great. And that's something that I definitely want to kind of make note of, because they lost 2 games in that tournament, both to APAC region teams. So they've looked good in the West. They did struggle against some APAC region teams when they played them back in the Midseason Madness. That's something just to keep an eye on. Maybe that is something that doesn't continue on here, but it's definitely something worth talking about and discussing. This is a team that is led by an incredibly strong support line and an incredible tank in Hanbin. He might not play full-time. They also have Fearless, of course, who might pull out the Winston. But a lot of D.Va, a lot of Zarya recently. Hanbin may be the hero, or the player they're relying on for that. I know there's some patches coming through, and I think Zarya is not going to be as strong, so we might see a lot of Winston. If we do, definitely expect to see a lot of Fearless out of the Fuel, but Hanbin's been really, really good this year. If they want to rely on him, I definitely wouldn't be surprised if it was with D.Va. They put in Hanbin for that. They also had a lot of really good play out of their flex DPS players, so Sparkle and Doha, but Hitscan has been where they've really struggled the most this year. Edison has stepped up his Sojourn game quite a bit, but Guerrillo did not look very good when he was playing the Hitscan. Midseason Madness is a pretty hard hitscan meta, and they just did not look very good. And I think in this tournament, they might have the weakest hitscan play in the entire field of 12. So despite the fact they're the number 1 team in the world, that is a pretty obvious weakness for this team. There aren't many, if any, hitscan players in this playoffs that I think the Dallas Fuel are better in that role than. But I think if Hitscan is not the prominent, dominant hero like it was in the Midseason Madness, this team should be fine. If they can get away with the Genji or the Echo, Sombra even, they're really, really good in those roles. And as long as Edison on Sojourn can kind of be that secondary DPS player, you just need to kind of get those moments and those big plays every so often, I think they'll be fine. They're definitely one of the favorites to win this. They do have an area of concern in that Hitscan role, but generally speaking, they are a pretty solid team. And I think that they should be one of the favorites as we head into the playoffs. Moving on to the global number 2 seed, we have the San Francisco Shock. They were the runner-ups in the Midseason Madness and the runner-ups in the Western Region Countdown Cup. They are led by Proper. That's all you really need to know about Proper. He is an incredible player. He is one of the MVP favorites for this year, if not the MVP favorite. He has been incredible. He is definitely the Rookie of the Year front runner of this season. And he's been an incredible DPS star for this team. His Tracer, his Hangzhou, I mean, his Genji, everything. He's playing everything at a really, really, really high level. And the rest of the roster around Proper is a very solid roster. They have some areas where I don't think they're incredible. They have Violet on the main support. He's traditionally a flex support player, so he's known for his Zenyatta play mostly. But they've been putting him on the main support. He's playing on a Lucio this year. He's a pretty good Lucio. He's not the best, but he's good enough that this team has looked pretty good. They're solid in the other spots, obviously, with Sam and Striker and Kilo rounding out their DPS line. And Collusion Mikey this season have been good enough for this team, and that they have had a very, very good run this season. The problem with this team is that they're coming off of their weakest run and meta so far this season. They didn't lose a game until their final match, or so they didn't lose a regular season match until their final match in the Summer Showdown qualifiers against the Dallas Fuel. And then they lost 3 in the Countdown Cup. So they went 20-4, which is a very good record, but struggling in this most recent meta, 3-3 overall, with losses to Washington, who aren't in the playoffs, Houston, and I believe Toronto is the other team they lost to. And they did, they beat the Atlanta Reign in a close series, and then they beat New York and London. So this most recent meta was not very good for this team. And in the biggest games this season, they've shrunk pretty significantly. They looked very good in the the Midseason Madness upper bracket finals, and in the grand finals, they kind of shrunk, made some questionable decisions, some things that people kind of look at and kind of scratch their head at. So the Shock have been a very good team, but they've had some moments this season where things don't look as great. But Krusty and the San Francisco Shock are 2-time grand finals champions. Violet's been on, he's won twice, so this is a team that has a lot of potential, has a lot of really strong players. They're the best team that hasn't won anything yet this season, but they certainly are a potential front runner and one of the teams that has a very good shot at potentially winning the playoffs. Moving on to the global number 3 seed, we have the Los Angeles Gladiators. This team won the kickoff clash in the Western region, as well as won the Midseason Madness. So they are the most successful roster this season when it comes to tournament victories. They're the only team that has won 2 tournaments this year. They won the first global tournament we had in the Midseason Madness, and they did so in a pretty convincing fashion. However, they did miss out on the Summer Showdown, which was the tournament we had prior to the playoffs. The meta in that one was a different one. It was the Jotes meta, the Junker Queen heavy meta. The team struggled quite a bit with Junker Queen originally. They went 2-4 in those qualifiers. They still almost made it in. And there's a lot of people who said that if they did, they probably would have won, or at least they would have been a very legitimate contender to win in the Summer Showdown. So this is a team that kind of got rode off after the Summer Showdown in some people's eyes, but they are the only team heading into the playoffs with a 6-0 record in the Countdown Cup. So despite the fact that they missed the Summer Showdown, and they have, generally speaking, not been as good in the regular season as the likes of the Dallas Fuel and the San Francisco Shock, they have been easily the best team in tournaments so far this season. They have lost 1 tournament game all year, and it was the upper bracket finals in the Midseason Madness to the Shock, who they then, of course, beat in the grand finals. So they've been very, very good in tournament play, and this is a very, very well-rounded roster. I think that they have one of the most elite all-around rosters in the entire league. They look incredible. They're coming in hot. I think they're coming in a little under the radar for some people because they didn't look incredible in the Countdown Cup, but they still went 6-0. They still got the wins when they needed them. And I think this is a team that just gets better and better and better. And I feel like they are definitely one of the clear frontrunners for this playoffs. Next, global number 4 seed is the Seoul Dynasty. This is the overall number 1 seed in the Eastern or APAC region. So the Asia teams. Seoul was the top seed out of those 7 in the Eastern region. They were victorious in the kickoff clash in the APAC region this year, so the first tournament of the year, as well as runner-ups in the Summer Showdown in the APAC region. So in the 2 regional tournaments in the Eastern region, the Seoul Dynasty finished with the best overall results. better than the other teams in the region. Obviously, they didn't win the Summer Showdown, but they did do pretty well in it, getting second place. They did not do great in the Midseason Madness, but they have been a very consistently good team this season. I'm pretty sure the worst qualifier they had was 4-2. They were 5-1 in the Summer Showdown. They were 5-1 in the Midseason Madness, I believe, and they were 5-1 in the Countdown Cup. So they've been very, very consistently good all season. They just have not looked as great in that global tournament in the Midseason Madness. Other than that, they've been a very, very solid team all around the season. Super well-rounded roster with Profit in the DPS line, kind of arguably greatest Overwatch player of all time, or most successful Overwatch player of all time. Smurf, as their only tank, has been absolutely incredible all year. Another one of those MVP frontrunners. They don't really have a weakness on this roster, right? Vindame and Iris and their support line have both been very, very good this year. And then their DPS secondary kind of position with either Fitz or Stalker, depending on what they need. So in general, the APAC region has not had the same kind of overall kind of results when you look at the Midseason Madness, right? But the Seoul Dynasty certainly come into this tournament as the best looking team from the APAC region. Overall, the APAC teams looked better than the majority of the Western region teams when you look at the Midseason Madness, but it was the teams like the Gladiators and the Shock and the Atlanta Reign that the Eastern region teams struggled quite a bit with in that Midseason Madness. So I think the Dynasty, another one of those clear front runners here. They look really, really good. They're coming in a pretty, they look pretty good. They probably would have gone 6-0 in the Countdown Cup if not for the fact that they qualified so early and started focusing on scrimming for playoffs. They probably would have gone 6-0. But Dynasty, definitely they're one of my personal favorite teams going into this playoff. They look really strong. They look really solid. And I think that you have to expect them to have a pretty good result. And I'd be surprised if they have a result worse than what they had in the Midseason Madness. Shanghai Dragons are the next team. They're our global number 5 seed. So they're going to be the first overall seed playing on our first day of matches. Obviously, the 1 through 4 seeds don't play on the first day. They play on the second day for their first games. But the 5 seed is going to be our best team on the first day that we see. And the Shanghai Dragons are coming into this playoff as the champions of the Summer Showdown in the Eastern region. So they beat the Seoul Dynasty in the Summer Showdown. They also were the champions in 2021 overall, like I said before. But they've had a somewhat rocky season. Their first tournament was pretty good record-wise, but they didn't win very convincingly. Midseason Madness, they looked pretty good, but did not do as well in the tournament itself because of the Atlanta Reign and their incredible stuff. We'll talk about them more. Really good Summer Showdown. They were the most dominant team in that tournament in the APAC region by far, and a pretty lackluster showing in the Countdown Cup that just did not look very, very good. So they've shown an ability to be really, really good in the right meta with the right players and in the right situations, but they've had a somewhat rocky season. But at their best, another team that has the very clear opportunity to compete and potentially win the tournament. And this, to me, these 5 teams I've talked about here, I think are the 5 most likely teams to win the playoffs. The Shanghai Dragons, obviously, they've been in there before, right? They won last year. The entire roster won it last year with the exception of Bebe, who's their backup flex support. Every other player on this team was on the championship roster last year. They know what they're doing. They know how to win. They're a very strong team with a really good head coach in Moon. They're really good at every role. They don't really have a weakness. They just haven't looked as dominant as they have in the past. A lot of that is just the talent around them in other teams across the league is also getting really, really good. I also think that the APAC team struggled a bit in the Midseason Madness because they just weren't used to what they were playing against. And there were just so many more teams from the West that they didn't really have the same ability to find success against some of those other teams. So I think it's going to be an interesting look in the playoffs. I think the APAC teams should do better this time around. They've had more time to scrim against the Western region teams. They've had more time to be in the West. And so I think we'll see a better performance overall from the APAC region than we did in the Midseason Madness. And I think the Shanghai Dragons are certainly one of the teams I have my eyes on to potentially go the distance and win the whole thing and repeat as Overwatch League champions. Next, we have the Houston Outlaws, the number 6 seed globally. They haven't really had any major accolades this season. They didn't win any tournaments. They didn't finish top 2 or top 3 in any tournaments. But they've been a consistently solid team all year long that just hasn't really had it together when it comes to the playoffs and tournaments. But they have a really solid DPS duo in Merit and Pelican, who have been one of the best duos all season. They're incredible players who have been really, really good and have done a lot to kind of help carry this team, as well as Dante, who originally is a DPS player, but he has been playing the majority of the tank play for this team this season, whether it be the Junker Queen, the Zarya, the Doomfist. He has been playing a lot of that, even Diva. So a lot of their success really hinges on whether or not Dante can find success on the tank role, right? If he looks good and he can play stuff he's comfortable on, this team will look pretty good. They do have another tank player in Doge, but generally speaking, this Houston Outlaws roster does not look as good when he's in. He also doesn't have a visa, so I don't even know if he'll be at the playoffs. It's up in the air at this point in time. So Dante's looked good, but I think when he goes up against the best of the best, he doesn't always look as good. He's had really good performances against Hanbin this season. They have not lost to the Dallas Fuel yet this season, so in that regard, you have to feel pretty good about the Houston Outlaws, what they've done. Their sport line looks really good, especially with creative in there now. They look really well-rounded. And so I think this is a good team. I think it's going to be tough for them to win the whole thing. I don't really feel the most confident in them, especially because their tournament performances this year have been relatively lackluster. But I certainly like some of what they have, and I think that there's a really good look to what this Outlaws team has done. They could definitely surprise some people. I also wouldn't be surprised if they bounce out somewhat early. A lot of it hinges on what the meta is and what they're able to play comfortably. And that, to me, is why the Outlaws are a super risky bet, but definitely one of those teams that I could see getting a top 4 overall finish just based on what they, the opposition they play and whatnot. But I think it's really tough for them to climb the hurdle that is teams like the Shock and the Dynasty and the Fuel and the Gladiators consistently. They could get 1, maybe 2 of those wins, but I don't know if that's enough to get them all the way to a Grand Finals victory. Next, we have the Atlanta Reign. First half of this season for the Reign. 3rd place finish in the kickoff clash in the West. 3rd place overall in the Midseason Madness. Really good run from them early in the season. They have dipped a bit in the second half of the season, which is interesting because they did add some really big name players to this roster in the second half of the season, most notably Speedily and Vigilante. And so those 2 players come in and add a lot to this Reign roster. I think they look really, really good overall as a talent. The question really is, can they bring that same energy that they had before Speedily and Vigilante were there? Those good finishes in the kickoff clash in the Midseason Madness. Can they bring those back? And can they repeat some of the success that they had in those 2 tournaments and in the playoffs and the tournaments last year? Where, of course, they finished 2nd in the Grand Finals last year after an incredible playoff run that saw them defeat a bunch of really good teams like the LA Gladiators last year and the San Francisco Shock and the Dallas Fuel, right? So they've shown that they have the ability to compete with a lot of the best. And there's a lot of really good players on this team. Kai has been incredible this season. Hawk has been really, really good this season. I think their support line with Ultraviolet, OG, Vigilante will be really, really good this year. So this is a really solid team that has some of the highest peaks in the league. But the problem is we haven't really seen them hit that peak consistently. But generally speaking, they do hit those peaks in tournaments. That's when they look their best. They've always been that way in their, honestly, their entire existence. They're a team that when tournament time comes around, they add an extra step to their game, and I feel really confident that they should be able to at least look better in this playoffs than we've seen from them recently. I like this team a lot. They're probably one of my dark horse candidates, probably my #1 dark horse candidate. I have another one I want to talk about here in a little bit, but I like what we've seen from the Reign. I think they have a lot of potential. I think it's going to come down to how well they really kind of hit those peaks and how well they can stay in stride with a lot of these really good teams that are going to be in this playoff bracket. Next is the London Spitfire, one of the most interesting teams going into this playoffs. They've been very consistent this season. They had a somewhat weak opening qualifier, but the second and third qualifiers, they were a very solid team. They were pretty good in the 4th qualifier as well, though they did have some weaknesses. That was probably their weakest tournament outside of the first one, was that Countdown Cup. But a lot of their success has been on the back of their main tank, Hadi, and he has been playing a lot of Reinhardt. The team itself doesn't really want to be referred to as a Reinhardt team because they do run a lot of other things. But they run significantly more Reinhardt than the other teams around them do. It's kind of a European thing. It's been a big thing with European Overwatch, is a lot of Reinhardt rush-based compositions. And it's worked for them at times. It hasn't worked for them at other times. I think they're coming into this playoffs in a pretty rough position because they didn't look great, like I said, in the Countdown Cup. They were kind of okay in the Midseason Madness, where they had a first-round win that was kind of a surprise. But they also struggle against the Florida Mayhem, who are a decent team, but they're not great. They're not one of the best teams in the region, not one of the best teams going into this playoffs. And so they struggle against a team consistently. That gives me a lot of worries. I don't think they've beaten Florida this season. Maybe they're 1-3 against them, but they've struggled a lot against the Mayhem. And if they have to meet the Mayhem, that's a big concern for me with this team. But they've looked really good across the board. I've really liked what we've seen from Sparker this season and Backbone, as well as their support players with Admiral and Landon and Khan, who they got from the Paris Eternal. They look very, very good, and I love Shax. He doesn't get a lot of playtime right now, but when he does and he gets to play Tracer, he looks very, very good. So the Spitfire have potential, but they run unconventional stuff. And I think going into a new meta, there's a possibility that that works better, because they just go and they say, we're going to run what we know, what we're going to be comfortable with, and that's how we succeed. But sometimes that doesn't work. And sometimes you do that and your team does not do what you kind of want, and you look kind of weak. And if they run into the Florida Mayhem, I don't really think the Spitfire are going to take a win, because they just haven't shown the ability yet this season to do that consistently. So they're an interesting team, one of the ones that I think is really tough to kind of place and read going into the playoffs, but they've been pretty solid, and I think that they are going to be a fun team at the very least to watch in this playoffs. Up next is the Philadelphia Fusion. They were the runner-ups in the kickoff clash in the APAC region. So they were pretty good early on. They were runner-ups in the first tournament of the season, and they also finished 4th in the Midseason Madness. They were the highest-placed team from the APAC region in the Midseason Madness. So their regular season record has been relatively lackluster. They haven't looked incredible in the regular season, but when tournaments come around, they have looked very, very good. They were top 3 in both of the APAC tournaments and the top 4 finish in the Midseason Madness. They have a really, really great DPS duo with MN3 and Zest. MN3 on the hit scan, Zest on the flex DPS. Now, Zest is coming off of a hand injury. I don't think it's super serious, but they may not be at 100%, which is an area of concern. I was concerned for them going into the Midseason Madness because they all had COVID, or a bunch of them had COVID, and they still got 4th. So I don't know if it matters that much, but it is something to keep an eye on with this team. How much is he Zest? Maybe we see more Carpe, who is their other DPS player. We'll see. But in their tank role, they have Fury, who is still, in my opinion, one of the best flex tanks or off tanks or just general now tanks in the Overwatch League and in the history of Overwatch. He is a GOAT. He is a god amongst men, in my opinion. He is incredible, and he's having a very good year, kind of reviving his career. If we see Winston, we'll probably see more Bellisria, who is their other tank player. But overall, this team is very solid and very strong, and I think they are my other dark horse team. Their support line is kind of hit or miss, but when they do get their stuff together and they play their best, this team is really good, and we've seen their good performances getting 4th in the Midseason Madness, right? They beat the Dallas Fuel in the Midseason Madness. So this is a team that looks good come tournament time. I don't know if they have what it takes to go the extra mile and overcome some of those big juggernauts in the top 5 consistently, but I would not be surprised if this is a team that has a really strong finish in the playoffs overall, because I think this team is in a really good spot, and I love what they have done so far this season. Next is the Florida Mayhem, another team that I'm not a huge believer in going into this playoffs. I don't love what they've done so far this season. They've looked much better in the second half of the season. They've had a pretty good run over the past month or so. Even going back to the Summer Showdown, they looked pretty good as well. And a lot of that comes down to, I think, a really, really, really good amount of Sojourn play from Hydron, who I think is probably right now the best performing player on this team. He looks really good on Sojourn. He's really comfortable on the hero. He's one of the best in the world on her. And so if Sojourn continues to be meta, this team is a dangerous threat for that reason and that reason alone. I don't think this team has highs that are going to be consistently able to beat a lot of your top teams. But I think that they have a very strong chance of performing well against a lot of your mid-level teams. Teams like London, who I mentioned before. Teams like Philadelphia. Teams like Houston. Teams like Atlanta. And those types of wins can snowball into something. Because if other upsets are happening, maybe Florida can find their way. And maybe they end up in a place where they only have to win one of those big-name games against a big team. And they can do that. I think it's tough for them to go all the way. I don't think they have the highs of a lot of the other really good teams this year. But I think they have a very strong base to this roster. And I think Hydron and his play has been really, really good so far this year. And I think if they play their game and they play comfortable and they just kind of play loose, this team has a really good shot at winning a lot of games in this playoffs. Second to last team here is the Toronto Defiant. They have an incredible support line with Chorong and Twilight. I think it's one of the best in the league. And they get some pretty good performances out of their tanks and their DPS. But overall, they've had pretty middling results for this season. They finished 12-12, about as middling as you can get. I do think they were -1, though, unfortunately. So they were not 12-12 with a 0 differential. They did finish top 3 in the Summer Showdown in Toronto in front of their home crowd. So that definitely was a sign that this team has a lot of potential. But I think there are definitely some areas where this team just does not feel like they have that second gear that other teams have. Hisu, their hitscan DPS player, has been really, really good all year. And I think Finale has been really good all year. But it just seems like in the tank line, they don't have that second gear. They don't have that next level, that killing blow, that just next little bit of boost that they need to kind of really be really, really good. I love what they have in terms of talent on this team, but consistency has been a huge issue for this team. They have not been able to look consistently solid against a lot of your top-level teams. Yes, they beat the LA Gladiators in the Summer Showdown. Yes, they beat the San Francisco Shock in the Countdown Cup. But they've also struggled against those teams in the past. And in the biggest games in particular, they've looked kind of their weakest, with the exception of that Countdown Cup third-place finish. So I think this is a good team, and I think that if they can get a meta that works for what they have, I think they'll be pretty good. But I don't think they're good enough to kind of dominate other teams. I think their style of victory in this tournament, it's going to be ugly. It's going to take a while. But I think they are good enough in a lot of their talent areas where they could find victory, quite decent amounts of it in this playoffs. I think their roster and their talent looks better than where they've finished so far this season. I definitely want to see more from them, but overall they've been somewhat middling this season. Final team in the playoffs is the Hangzhou Spark. They were one of the best teams in terms of record for the first half of the season, but in the second half of the season, they went 2-10. They were not really predicted by a lot of people to win the playoffs or the play-in tournament in the APAC region, but a win over the Chengdu Hunters, a 3-0 convincing win over the Chengdu Hunters in the APAC play-ins, pushed them into our playoffs. And they made a lot of roster changes late in the season, subbing players in and also bringing in new players, obviously, in their support line with Neko and Teru, putting Pineapple in the DPS line, continuing to switch between Gushui and Bernard. It's a team that made a lot of changes as the season progressed. But their most recent look has been pretty solid so far. They got a win over the Seoul Dynasty. They, almost beat the Shanghai Dragons, got that win over the Chengdu Hunters with Pineapple in the lineup, as well as putting in some players in the backline, kind of changing it up a bit. Who knows what they're going to run backline-wise. They seem to play their best when they have Super Rich in, so we might see Super Rich and Teru as opposed to Super Rich and Irony, or Teru and Irony, depending on what the meta is. But that's really seemingly where they have been the most comfortable this season. And so they look like they are in a better position now than they were just a couple weeks ago. I feel a lot better about this team now than I did going into the play-ins and kind of late in the season. And so they have really high peaks, and a lot of that comes down to Shy, their hitscan DPS player, being such an incredible talent who just carries games a lot of the time. They were really, really good in the Midseason Madness, and a lot of that came down to Shy. And if it's a really strong Winston meta, I think Gushui, their main tank player, could do a lot which is what we saw against Chengdu, where they just looked really, really good with Gu Shuiyan. And so this to me is an interesting team, because despite the fact that they're the 12 seed, I think their peaks are higher than your Floridas and your Torontos and your Houstons and your Atlantas, potentially. But they are so inconsistent when it comes to hitting those peaks that I don't have a ton of faith in this team being able to do that consistently. But they're a dangerous team. They certainly can upset the Shanghai Dragons round 1. They certainly can upset other teams. They won in a pretty big upset in the Midseason Madness when they beat the Seoul Dynasty. They certainly can do it again. They have talent. They have the pieces that you need. And we've seen them play pretty well so far this season. It's just a matter of can they do it consistently. So that's it. Those are all 12 of your teams. Those are a little bit of information on all of them. And that's kind of where I feel these teams are as we head into this playoff tournament. Super excited for the playoffs. I am ready for what I think is going to be the best playoff we've had yet in Overwatch League. So if you guys are excited for the playoffs, let me know in the comments down below your thoughts on all of the teams, and check back in Friday when I give you guys my bracket predictions, who I think is going to win this year's playoffs and all that. So that's going to be all for me for today. Thank you all so much. Once again, if you enjoyed and want more videos like this in the future, consider liking and subscribing, as it does help out a bunch. That is going to be all for me for today. Thank you all once again. Hope you're all staying safe and staying healthy. And until next time, bye-bye.